This is our final buys video of the season. Most of you already had your trade deadline. If you have had your trade deadline, drop in the comments. Tell us when your trade deadline is. But these are guys that if you still have the opportunity to trade for them, you should be doing it in our opinion. And there are a handful of leagues. Most of my leagues actually haven't had the trade deadline yet. So hopefully we still have another week to go and make some moves. Maybe if everybody's trade deadline is in week 14, we do another one of these. But let's give you some guys that you should trade for in fantasy football, especially because of their playoff implications. Let's start with A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown has not had a 20-point game since week 6 against Cleveland. Since then, he's actually not even had a game above 8 targets. So between the lack of target volume and the fact that he hasn't had a touchdown at all since week 7, A.J. Brown's now the wide receiver 21 on the season. Obviously, he missed those 3 games. But you've seen A.J. Brown he has had a little bit of production taken away from him by guys like Dallas Goedert, who has been, catching some touchdowns at times of the season. Devonta Smith has not been anything crazy, but you have had games in the last couple weeks 8 and 9 in particular, where Devonta Smith has taken touchdowns in weeks where A.J. Brown did not have a touchdown. And really what you're looking at is the last couple weeks for A.J. Brown in the schedule. It really wasn't that bad. The Giants, the Bengals, the Jaguars, and then the Cowboys, and then the Commanders. And the Commanders did a better job, and their defense, I think, is a little bit underrated. But really what I want to be looking at is the end-of-season schedule for A.J. Brown. We'll start next week, playing the Rams. The Rams, that projects to be a pretty high-scoring game. It usually is. I would expect A.J. Brown to have a touchdown next week. The week after that, you have Baltimore. Baltimore gives up a ton of points to wide receivers, more than anybody else in the league. The week after that, Carolina. Carolina, if they're not first, because Baltimore is, they're probably second in giving up wide receiver points. They play Pittsburgh in week 15. It's the first round of the playoffs, but do keep in mind, Pittsburgh, really good against running backs, average against wide receivers. Okay, they're right there in the middle of the pack, so we're not worried about that. Playing Washington again in week 16 is tough, and then Dallas in week 17 should be a fine matchup for him. So the rest of the season, the playoffs are a little bit harder than these next 3 or 4 weeks. However, the schedule itself overall is one of the better schedules for alpha wide receivers in the league. And A.J. Brown is a guy that is going to be a little bit hot and cold here. You do see him have up and down games in terms of his yardage, and again, up and down games in terms of his touchdown production. But touchdowns are volatile. And so I'm going to bet that later in the season, A.J. Brown is going to start scoring some touchdowns again. And once that happens, you see what has been his floor, which has been like 11 to 12 points, go up to score 18 to 25 points. And that's where you see A.J. Brown at his best. He has been, again, dealing with injuries, but I think he's going to be fully healthy for the rest of the season. I think this is an Eagles team that's in the mix right now, and so I think it's going to lead to them being competitive, being aggressive, especially offensively, and I think these next couple of weeks could get you some wins that may get you into the playoffs if you're able to go buy A.J. Brown. So A.J. Brown is a guy I think you should go trade for. In terms of who I'm giving up, when you're looking at the rest of season rankings on Flock Fantasy, we have A.J. Brown right now collectively at, it looks like we still have him at number 10. My guess is he drops after this week. He's going around Nico, Amon-Ra, Jahmyr Gibbs, Drake London, Alvin Kamara. I think he's going to go down a tier here.
Yeah, he will.
I think the experts will move him down.
He'll probably be in the Neighbors Cup, Tyreek Hill
and
tier.
I would probably make that move.
Yeah.
So if you can, move off of some of those level guys and get A.J. Brown, which I think in some leagues you still can, I would do that. I'd trade for A.J. Brown.
Yeah. Terry McLaurin is going to be another guy here that we like as a buy. And I know it was only 1 week, right? Kind of a fluky week where he had 2 points. Number one, you're going to have some people that do panic about that because the last couple of weeks, honestly, Jaden Daniels has not been that great. And it's not his fault. He still looks really solid, plenty of passing volume and all of that. But from a production perspective, what he's providing volume-wise, it's not going to be anything elite level. Here's a couple things I know about Terry McLaurin. Number one, it does not take elite target volume for him to be ultra productive this year because of how much Daniels likes to push the ball downfield. Number two, you're going to have people that are worried about B-Rob being back healthy and Austin Eckler both producing in the same week against Philadelphia. I would take the Philadelphia matchup with a grain of salt because you've got Vic Fangio as the defensive coordinator there, and if you know anything about a Fangio defense, it's that they do not like allowing big plays and big shots downfield. In fact, they hate it so much that they just let you have everything underneath. That really is the cost of a Fangio defense. And for an offense like Washington, who lives off of those explosive plays, this was just a tough matchup against Philadelphia. And I do think you're going to have some better matchups ahead. You've got Dallas in week 12 for Terry McLaurin, which I think is really a cakewalk with as bad as Dallas looks. Tennessee, they do have a really solid secondary and a solid defense overall, but they have allowed some explosive plays, have been known to do that in the secondary as well. And again, Terry could get 5 targets in that game and have another 20 points like he's demonstrated in multiple games this season to date. When you're looking at his overall production for the season, Terry has had only a couple of games where he's had less than 10 points. First 2 weeks of the season, 3 and 8 points while Daniels was figuring it out. After that, he went on a run of 20, 18, 13, 23, 15, 17, 15, and 16 points. Then he has the 2-point game against Philadelphia, right? If you're going to bet on anything, I would bet on the consistency of that 8-week stretch that you saw with Terry and not be too worried rest of season with his outlook. You do have the bye week in week 14, which is unfortunate, but I do think that the matchups like Atlanta, like Dallas, like New Orleans in week 15, the first week of the playoffs, that's going to be something that you're going to want to look at and see if anyone's worried about the running back situation in Washington, and if you can get Terry at a discount. Right now, his value is still behind CeeDee Lamb. I would trade CeeDee Lamb and I would go get Terry McLaurin personally.
Yeah.
I would trade DK Metcalf and I would go get Terry McLaurin. You've now seen JSN is kind of maintaining this consistent production, even with DK back in the lineup after the bye week. That's good to see. Terry has less competition that you're worried about. James Cook is very hit or miss. He has some really good games. He has some really bad games. Terry McLaurin is going to be a lot more consistent for you. Those are the types of guys that I'd be looking to move if you can go get Terry.
Let's pivot over to Jacobi Meyers. And I think before this week, you could have admitted that Jacobi Meyers, who I've been higher on Jacobi Meyers more than anybody the entire season. One, because he's one of my favorite fantasy football assets and has been for a couple of years now. But number 2, I have him on in the Flock League, right? Was the wide receiver 34 coming into this week, and this week you saw him only put up 8 points. He had 6 targets. He had caught 4 of those for 28 yards, but pretty underwhelming compared to having 8 receptions for 100 yards the week before the bye, I should say, and then 17 points because he had a touchdown in week 8 against Kansas City. Now, what you did see is Brock Bowers explode in this game, which has been a theme when Gardner Minshew has been on the field with him. Brock Bowers had 16 targets today. And so the thing is, like, I have both of these guys. I start both of these guys because I do think they both can be productive alongside each other. However, that pendulum swung more towards Bowers today, and that's where Jacobi Meyers lost his production, right? And so on a normal basis, what I think you're going to see is what you saw in weeks 3, 4, 5, 9, 10, 9 targets, and then 7 and 11 targets in week 8 and 9 from Jacobi Meyers, where I think you're going to see more of that 9 to 10 targets per game range just because it is so concentrated there in Vegas, where you're running most of the offense through Brock Bowers, through Jacobi Meyers, and then through whatever back is going to be back there as well. And so with Jacobi, I'm looking at his rest of season schedule. A game against Denver next week, where he's probably going to have Patrick Surtain on him, and then Kansas City is tougher. However, he plays Tampa Bay in week 14, goes and plays Atlanta in week 15, Jacksonville in week 16, and New Orleans in week 17. So some really good matchups to end the year. A little bit tougher right out the bat, but then some good matchups to end the year. If you can wait, if your trade deadline is late enough, then I would wait to buy Jacobi Meyers until maybe after the Kansas City game. But if you have your trade deadline coming up, I do think it's somebody that when you're looking at his playoff games, he is going to get a lot of target volume, and that's going to directly translate to production. A lot of people might ask, okay, are you concerned about the hamstring injury? Personally, with him having the hamstring injury, going through practice this week, and then coming out and playing on the injury this week, I'm not super worried about it yet. Again, I think more of what you saw today, or yesterday rather, was I think you just saw more of the pendulum swing towards Brock Bowers' side of the production. I think those targets will even out. I think Jacobi Meyers will continue to get targets at a very high rate this season. I think that, when you're looking at his rest of season value using the Flock Fantasy consensus rankings, like I said, I'm much higher on him than most people. He's ranked as the 72nd overall player, the 34th wide receiver. He's being ranked around guys like Ramondre Stevenson, Cade Otton, Kyle Pitts, Najee Harris, Cedric Tillman, Kareem Hunt, and most of these guys I would send for Jacobi Meyers pretty easily, in my opinion. So I think if you can afford to get a high target, high volume guy, I think Jacobi Meyers might be the cheapest one. We do know Gardner Minshew is capable of supporting productive fantasy wide receivers. You've seen it now 2 years in a row, and so I'm not worried about that at all. I think Jacobi Meyers is somebody that if you can afford to go get on your fantasy team still, if you can do it after week 13, do it. If you have to do it now, it's worth doing it now, in my opinion.
Yep. We're going to give you another big name running back here, and that is Kiron Williams. We haven't talked much about Kiron or really addressed how poorly his production has been the last couple of weeks.
It's been
how
very
poor
poorly.
his production has been the last couple of weeks. Dating back to week 9 against Seattle, 10 points. Week 10 against Miami, 11 points. He just had a game against New England, 8 points. This is, in my opinion, one of the easier buys because you know exactly why his production has gone down. The touchdowns left. The touchdowns have not been there the last few weeks. There are multiple reasons for that. Number one, you've got some stout defenses there against Miami and New England, who are really going to stack the box and not let McVay just run all over them. They are going to make him pass it. And you also have Cooper Kupp and Puka combining for 3 total touchdowns against New England. They both went insane this week. But again, you're looking at the first half of the season for Kiron: 14, 15, 31, 20, 15, 19, and 22 points. And that was with a ton of rushing attempts. Those rushing attempts have not gone down. He's gotten 15 carries apiece the last couple of games, 22 carries against Seattle where he had 10 points. His floor, again, even with no touchdowns and not an insane amount of receiving usage or receiving work outside of the Miami game, his floor is anywhere from 8 to 12 points. This is the Josh Jacobs effect. You could call this the 2023 Joe Mixon effect. When the volume is there and the receiving work you even see in glimpses here and there, and the efficiency is there and the opportunity is consistently there, you know without a shadow of a doubt that guy is going to be a buy if the only thing that's missing from that equation is the touchdowns. They're going to come back. You've got Philly next week. If I were a betting man, I would expect Kiron Williams to drop a ridiculous amount of points next week against Philly. We just talked about why Terry did not produce very much against Philadelphia, why a lot of receivers don't have a ton of explosive play opportunity against Philadelphia because of Fangio. I think Kiron is going to do really well against them next week. And then he's got New Orleans after that. He's got Buffalo after that, San Fran, the Jets, Arizona, Seattle. Like it is a very moderate schedule for the rest of the season, kind of middle of the pack. He's going to be fine. His volume's not going to go down. We know how McVay likes to use him. If you can get him at a discount with any team that's panicking right now, go ahead and do it. Been a rough 3-game stretch that's cost a lot of teams, including mine. And it sucks, but he is still a good value.
Let's talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. And he's been hit or miss. He's really fallen down expert rankings after that 39-point game that he had. Sorry, it wasn't 39 points. It was 29 points, I think. That 29-point game he had earlier in the season. Now, there are a couple reasons, actually, that I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is a particularly good buy for your fantasy team. Number one, his targets have been a little bit more consistent. He's getting at least 5 a game, which for an X-wide receiver like this is what you want to see. You've seen him get 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games, which is if for a guy like this, he's going to live off of touchdowns, 23 and 16 points, and then his floor is going to be 4 points still. Totally understand that. The thing with Marv is he's starting to bring in more of his targets, and that offense as a whole is looking quite a bit better. The Arizona Cardinals are going to be in the playoff hunt. This team is going to be slinging it.
They're in the division.
Kyler is going to be slinging it. And so I want pieces of this offense, whether it's James Conner, whether it's Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, even maybe a Michael Wilson or something like that in deeper leagues. Like, I want pieces of this offense that has looked pretty darn good recently, and against some tougher defenses, did what he did in his last game against the Jets, played Chicago the week before that, and then obviously he's played the Chargers before that, the Green Bay Packers, the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, he has had a tough schedule. But let's look at the rest of the season schedule for Marvin Harrison Jr. He starts in week 12, and he plays Seattle. Okay, Seattle. It's an average matchup. Minnesota's a great matchup for him. Really good matchup. Plays Seattle again. New England is a great matchup. And then that's in the first week of the playoffs. And then the second week of the playoffs, he plays Carolina. That is a great matchup. And then he plays the Rams, which will be a high-scoring matchup, probably with playoff implications.
Division implications.
This is best case scenario for his schedule.
Best possible.
Honestly, he may be the biggest buy on this list. Like, he seriously might, because he's already the wide receiver 17 coming into week 11. Obviously, it's going to go down because he had his bye week. He's going to end up as a low-end wide receiver 2 so far on the season. But I think we all know what his ceiling is. I think we all know what his upside is. And so in terms of the schedule, in terms of the team situation, in terms of positive game script, all of it, I think it's all going to be pointing towards Marvin Harrison Jr. I think he might end up being a league winner just based on his end-of-season schedule. I think he could get a lot of touchdowns, but again, I also think he's going to get a lot of targets. You keep in mind, he's also one injury away from getting almost twice the targets I think that he gets now. I think if you were to see an injury to Trey McBride, he were to miss any time at all, I think you would see Marvin Harrison Jr. get 9 to 10 targets a game at that point, which would be very significant for an ex-wide receiver. You're giving him even more opportunities to score touchdowns, and that's really what's important here. So he's a rookie. We project him to get better as the season goes on. I don't think there's any exception in this case as well. I think that if you can afford to go get Marv, you do it. I think that, again, he might be the biggest buy on this list. I think he's definitely somebody that I'm going to be wanting to have on my teams heading down the stretch when it comes to playoff time in fantasy football.
Yeah, I think this next one's going to be a little more controversial, but there's some decent arguments for why Kenneth Walker has a solid outlook for the rest of the season. And look, we know what Kenneth Walker is at this point. He is a low-end running back one with elite high-end running back one upside any given week, right? He can go off for 30 points. He can have a modest 13-point day. The volume is going to be there. It's going to be a little less consistent, but his receiving usage has been very encouraging, and that really compensates for the weeks that he doesn't get a ton of rushing usage. Since the injury, I'll just skip the first couple of weeks that he played where he went down. Goes up against Detroit, 33 points, right? He goes up against the Giants, 14 points. That's a solid defense, not a solid defense. San Fran, solid defense, 20 points. Atlanta, solid defense, 23 points. Buffalo, a tougher defense, 8.5 points. The Rams, 13. San Fran, 13 after the bye week. That 8-point game being the least productive game he's had since he came off the week 2 and 3 injury, I think is really nice to see. And he had a 3-touchdown game against Detroit, so you can kind of assume that that's the outlier. He's not going to get 3 touchdowns every single week, but he's salvaging his week with some red zone opportunities. Again, he's getting really solid receiving usage, or has demonstrated that over consistent stretches. Weeks 4 through 8, he had four of those 5 games. He had 5+ targets in those games. And again, he's capitalizing on that opportunity. 2 of the next 3 weeks, he's got Arizona. Those are good matchups for him and his production. He's got the Jets. You just saw Anthony Richardson, of all people, walk all over that defense. In the passing game, that is laughably bad for the Jets and shows how dysfunctional they are. Kenneth Walker's going to run all over them. So that's the next 3 weeks. You got Arizona, the Jets, Arizona, and then Green Bay in week 15, the first round of the playoffs. Minnesota's the kicker in week 16, and that's going to be tough to swallow. And that might be a game where you expect a dud game. But again, outside of that, I'm looking here at the next 4 weeks, and I'm looking to see if his value is going to increase over the next few weeks. And to me, I think it's worth the potential risk of him laying a dud in the playoffs if you can get what you're going to get from him over the next 4 weeks, where he's demonstrated a pretty nice floor, in my opinion, since he came back from that injury.
So there you go. Some guys that, if you still have the opportunity to do so, you should add to your fantasy team going into the playoffs. Do us a huge favor. Drop a like. Make sure you're subscribed if you play fantasy football. 2 ways that really show love. We appreciate that. It helps us out a ton. But we appreciate you guys so much. Thanks for watching. We've got another video coming for you tomorrow. We'll see you later.